thank you so much for being on our show. We noticed that you are, quite concerned about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. You have very high expectation for this framework. So, how do you see the highlights or uniqueness of this framework comparing to other framework?
Thank you very much for having me. And yes, we had a global biodiversity target for 2010. We didn't reach it. We had global biodiversity targets for 2020. We didn't reach them. Then in 2022, we agreed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework under China's leadership. And it sets a new set of targets to 2030. The reason I'm a little bit more hopeful this time is that there was higher level political engagement. We had a large involvement of broader array of stakeholders, public sector, private sector, philanthropic sector, and we saw more of a focus on the need to finance achieving these targets. So it's going to be very difficult, but I am hopeful with all of this political engagement, private sector, philanthropy, new financing, that we have a much better chance of achieving our global biodiversity targets by 2030 than we did for 2020 or 2010.
Except for this framework, China also, bring up announcement, invest 1.5 billion to build the Kunming Biodiversity Fund. So how do you see the significance of this fund? And how do you think this will help the global biodiversity conversation?
It's so important, the issue of financing. So if we look at the previous targets to 2010 and 2020, they were not adequately financed. So a big difference this time, going to 2030 under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, is much more focused on financing. Financing from government, the public sector, financing from private sector, and financing from philanthropy. And China announced its Global Biodiversity Fund, which was fantastic, showing leadership in advancing the issue of financing, and China putting money into this framework, into delivering on the targets, set a precedent, and others followed to put money in as well. Extremely important that we have adequate financing, and China's not only financing domestic efforts, but is also putting money into international cooperation and international efforts. So really important.
I know you must notice that recently China had a very, very important meeting, the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the CPC. The resolution emphasized that the Chinese modernization should be modernization of harmony between humanity and nature. This is a very, very important concept. And China, it shows ambitious to cut the carbon emissions, reduce pollution, and respond to climate change. So how would you evaluate these measures gonna take by China, and how you think it's gonna make a global impact to the green development?
China is exercising extraordinary leadership domestically and internationally in terms of addressing the multiple challenges of biodiversity loss, climate change, desertification, pollution, and more. And we saw the ecological civilization built into 5-year plans, and the idea that people need to live in harmony with nature. It's not people and nature, people are part of nature. We have to live in harmony, and this goes to the center of what the Chinese government has been doing. So if you bring them all together, you have more impact and you get a better return on your investment in tackling these various challenges together. So there's the emphasis on nature and the role that nature can play in all these issues. And then there's also the emphasis on technology. And China is looking at all of these issues together. This is not just about the environment, it's about culture, it's about environment, and it's about economy. We need to see economies grow, but we need to go on a different path in growing our economies. Grow our economies in a way that it's not having a detrimental effect on the environment. We can do that, and we are seeing a good shift in that direction.
This resolution also emphasized that to cultivate new quality productive forces. This is another very important concept, and encourage more companies and entrepreneurs to use new green technologies to transfer the traditional industries to the new green industries. So, as an expert on green field, what's your understanding on new quality productive forces? And how do you think this is going to drive development of green industry?
Yeah, it's really important. So I suppose my starting point, I always look to nature, the role that nature can play in addressing all of our challenges in economic development as well. But there's also the technology side. And if you look at the transition that China's making to green development and green pathways, it's quite an extraordinary transition. Look at what China's done with solar energy. It's the world's largest producer of solar energy panels. Look at what's happening with the production of batteries, the production of electronic vehicles, the use of electronic vehicles within China, the charging stations. This is a major transformation to electrify how we are producing and consuming. Massive shift. Many other opportunities, but this is all part of the transition and all part of what is being promoted by the Chinese government as we move from a reliance on fossil fuels to a reliance on more renewable sources of energy across all sectors.
My last question for you also about this resolution. It also emphasized that we should pursue to build a high standard opening up and multiple cooperation platforms for green development and green cooperation. So, Jordan, do you see some more opportunities or potentials when it comes to cooperation in this area between China and other countries?
Yes, international cooperation is critically important to make the transition. China is a very active party to all of the multilateral environmental agreements, the agreements on biodiversity, climate change, desertification, and many more. Very active, very involved. It's also very active and involved in the multilateral development banks, including having established new multilateral development banks over the past decade to address this transformation. So China is a very active player in multiple fora, be it multilateral environmental agreements, multilateral development banks, and also in UN processes, whether it's the UN Development Programme, UN Environment Programme, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and so many other fora. China is actively engaged in all of them, from the policy framework through to implementation, through to finance. That all comes together. That helps us make this transition.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.